Okay, so welcome to the Advocacy Brown Bag, everybody. I want to thank all of you for joining us in the middle of the day for an hour. I appreciate that, and I think it's going to be well worth your time. I want to thank the elected officials who are here with us today. I see ACHD Commissioners Hanson and I saw Mary May. I don't see her right now. And oh, there she is. Hi, Mary. And Boise City Councilwoman Elaine Clegg has joined us from an airport. So thanks, everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dan. I think this will be really interesting. And then we'll make sure that we have some time for you all to ask him some questions at the end of his presentation. So Dan is the managing principal with Renaissance Planning out of Arlington, Virginia. And his experience is in developing transportation solutions that balance transportation and land use options. And in order to optimize multimodal travel demand and transportation network services. And his description says in congested communities, which is great because as you all know, we are growing here and we are experiencing more and more congestion all the time. So Dan, you have the opportunity to go ahead and share your screen. And go ahead and get started, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you for being here.
Sure, thank you. I think I've got myself off mute and I'm about to share, so hopefully now you can see my screen. I'll just do a quick pause. Cynthia's nodding.
Yep.
I'm really glad to be here. I'll just give a little bit more background about myself. I've got 30 years of experience and have been both in the private sector and the public sector. And so you'll hear some ideas and stories that kind of span both sides, because particularly when it comes down to thinking about site impact of development, the whole message is all about getting the private sector and the public sector to be well coordinated, because both have a role in building great places, and that's building great places from both what I kind of call the static side or the fixed things, the buildings and so forth, as well as the moving side, to make sure that everybody in all modes is able to connect and achieve what they need to on a daily basis.
Just real fast, Dan, can I interrupt for a second? Can everybody make sure that you mute yourselves? We're getting some, okay, perfect. Okay, thanks.
That's great. I was just going to ask about that. I'm also very much involved with ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and one of the things we'll talk about is the current update to a recommended practice on how to do site impact analyses. The photo on the screen I took about 15 years ago when I was working for Montgomery County, Maryland, and this I took it just because I was attracted by the kind of relationship to the transect, which probably most of you are familiar with the image of rural on the left and urban on the right. And this is actually about a 200-acre infill site, so it's about 2 miles away from an end-of-line metro rail station in the Washington, D.C. area. And I've been using this without thought, really, as just a nice little iconic picture for ages. And then talking to Cynthia, she kind of said, well, tell me more about that. And so I realized that it had been a while since I had actually gone to see what was happening there. So as we talk about our agenda, this is what that same location looks like now, as more of that 200 acres has been developed. And, again, just a sign about development, even in places that you'd think are fast growing, like Montgomery County, that right behind me on the picture now on the screen now, they're still building multifamily homes to build out that development. So it takes a long time to get, infill on a 200-acre site. So what I want to kind of do today is recognize that we've got a lot of great interest in a whole bunch of kind of different topics that will all revolve around transportation and land use being integrated and thinking multimodally. And so what I want to suggest is that kind of 3 topics for today, and I got about 15 slides overall, but I do tend to kind of meander and think about stories and so forth that hopefully will help you understand the slides. So 3 categories, and I'm going to suggest maybe we just do a quick pause, at least between categories, for any ideas or questions. Cynthia, I appreciate you kind of watching the chat. So I want this to be a dialogue more than a presentation, but I know it's often efficient too to kind of keep questions to the end. So whatever works for you to type things in chat, and Cynthia, interrupt when you can. So again, what do we want to achieve? One thing that I think is that's come up in almost every conversation is a topic we'll talk about called Prorata share districts, which is a way of thinking differently and doing something different than a independent individual TIA. but that's still in most places in the country doing TIAs. And so now we're calling them multimodal transportation impact analyses. So you'll see that MTIA. And again, ITE has a draft or a proposed recommended practice that we are now in the process with a volunteer group of turning from proposed into making changes based on comments. And then there actually is a process within ITE to have the board of direction ultimately approve as a formal recommended practice. And as Cynthia noted, we'll leave some time open for discussion at the end. So actually through this ITE work, I've never actually been to the west coast of Oregon, and I want to go, but I just love this image from one of the communities along the Pacific Coast Highway, because they have recognized that the Pacific Coast Highway is part of their economy. And so they've got this great iconic image that has this great 2-lane scenic road just winding through the graphic. And they have, this is what's important to us. And nowhere on those 5 objectives does it say, we want you all to drive really quickly through our town. Really, if you kind of read between the lines, they really like you to have you drive slowly through their town and stop and get a coffee and the newspaper and all that kind of good stuff. So we often find that a challenge in whether it's for TIAs or whether it's for planning and implementing transportation in general, trying to balance what it is that we want as a community overall with what we tell our transportation planners, engineers are important to us. And so that just always thinking about how to bring those 2 things together is valuable. So, how are we measuring success? And for a long time, we focused on, how quickly can you move? We've gotten shifting a little bit more towards, what can you get to? How safely can you get there? So we are evolving. And then when you think about literally the public-private kind of integration for TIAs, we do need to have some things that it becomes a little bit more legalistic in many cases, because you do need to kind of have some benchmarks. We're going to accept something as being adequate if it meets a certain metric. We have to figure out, hey, if it's not adequate, is it big enough to worry about? Or is it, a technical term is de minimis, that is not significant? We do have to be thinking about legislative authority. And one of the key things, of course, with ITE's work is, here are some ideas that we see as being best practices or maybe emerging practices. Yet, if your local laws don't support them, you can't, well, you maybe could do them. If your local laws don't allow them, you can't do them until and unless you change those local laws. So the legislative authority, and there's usually a state and a local connection, and there's often a transportation and land use connection that maybe isn't always pulled together as well as we'd like to, because it's often, again, silos, often one agency doing land use development and another agency doing most of the transportation analyses, and they talk to each other, but around site impact studies, not always as well as we'd want. And that all comes back to, again, you're probably mostly familiar with the term rational nexus, which actually, which basically is that, when you get to a, to brass tacks, there just needs to be some connection in the TIA world to what the impact of the development is and what you're asking for. That nexus can be quite formal, and it can also be pretty fluid. I'll just say I'm actually in the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we have something here called the proffer system. And essentially it's the same thing that everybody else does, except the nature is the developer is in charge of saying, I offer that I will do this for you. But usually that ends up being, I proffer what you ask me to do. So that, there's a lot of nuances depending upon where you are. And that, I think, is maybe what some of you in the room today are interested in kind of moving on to is, how would we change our legislation to be thinking about things a little bit more multimodally and more integrated. This again is kind of a sloppy graphic, but it's back from my Montgomery County days, and just a way of thinking about the fact that, the public sector does probably the lion's share of transportation system implementation, operations, maintenance, but the private sector definitely has a role. And the idea here was to kind of show in Montgomery County, Maryland, there's sort of 2 scales of thinking about what you're developing and what you're building. And the x-axis on the graphic is essentially the geographic scale. So if you have a preliminary or a site plan, is the Montgomery County terminology, everything that goes into there is being done by the private sector. And then you have in Montgomery County a local area transportation review, which is basically a TIA. And Montgomery County also did something that was called a policy area review that essentially said your individual site might be fine and you might not have an impact for your site, But if you're in a part of our county where we are behind the eight ball, we're not implementing our master plans as quickly as development suggests they should be. You need to contribute, pay basically an impact fee just for that geographic area. And impact taxes are kind of in Montgomery County layered on top of that. And they went through a whole big thing about deciding rather than fighting the nexus, they were going to just bite the bullet and say, we're issuing a new tax. And that, 20, 30 years ago, that got put into place. And you kind of also see that, preliminary and site plans are very granular. You're down to, next year we want to implement a new bus shelter. Whereas some of the master planning, which you're trying to nest your development into your master plans, and things like, what alignment is a road going to be on? That might be 20 years away. So just kind of trying to hopefully get a sense that how we think about site development is really important in here, but it's also still connected to that broader, what does the community want to achieve, and what are the plans that go into guiding each site development. So again, a couple pictures, one from Montgomery County, so you get to see the shape of it. And for those who don't know, that little square at the bottom of the map, or a little diamond shape, is the 10-mile square of the District of Columbia. And basically the red dots are where the most development around metro rail stations are reaching into Montgomery County. The graphic on the right I'll get to, which is from Virginia DOT. And so this is all, again, as we kind of evolve, what are the ways of thinking about meaningful definitions of adequacy? And so one thing is, again, I'll talk more about shifting the idea of just thinking about vehicle trips to be thinking first about person trips, and then thinking about how those trips work by mode, and a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about adequacy. And, one of the things that Cynthia asked a few minutes ago was, well, we learn today about how to measure adequacy, and that really is kind of a depends, because there is tons of material out there about thinking about things in different ways. I'll give you some highlights of a few of them, but that might also spur some conversations. And in fact, one of those on the right graphic is Virginia DOT put into place a connectivity requirement. So that little image was, you have to have a certain ratio of nodes to links. And there's a great example of a measure that really is designed to promote walkability. So we all kind of know that the shorter the block lengths you have, the easier it is to navigate and to get from place to place as a pedestrian or as a bicyclist. But yet there's always a challenge if you try to regulate this, because of those kinds of nexus questions and legislative questions. They tried this for a few years and then pulled it out, partly because they found that people were figuring out how to game the system. Look, I've counted my links and my nodes and I pass, right? No, that's not really what we meant. So again, just the idea here is also maybe just encouragement. So don't get discouraged if you think we really want to move quickly and get a revolution going. It really is a matter of evolution more than revolution. And again, vehicle miles of travel is another great example where your neighbor to the west there, California, is doing this great experiment, which I think of it as every local government now, 300 little petri dishes across the state, trying to figure out how do we address this shift where we're no longer required by the state to think about auto level of service. It's still the option now of the local government to think about auto level of service, or to shift more towards things just like VMT or person trips or vehicle trips, where the kind of most progressive places, the San Franciscos, the Pasadenas, have already been there, kind of pushing for that opportunity. And I do want to say a word about accessibility, which again is something that many people, particularly in a walk bike community, see accessibility and think immediately of ADA. And when we tend to talk about accessibility in a planning perspective, we're saying not how fast can I go, but what can I get to? And so how many jobs or households, potential employees, healthy food, park access. You can, again, go down a whole bunch of lists of what you'd like to measure access to, and then thinking about what's across the street that's incredibly accessible, it scores very highly, versus what is 10 or 15 minutes away. And we're actually working right now with Federal Highway Administration on something called multimodal system productivity. And again, the upshot is thinking in terms of completing a trip, not in terms of going a certain speed. So that if you can walk across the street to your drugstore in 5 minutes, it doesn't matter that you're only walking at 2 miles an hour. You completed your trip in 5 minutes. So in an urban area, proximity is a real important element of thinking of accessibility. But if you are in a rural area, the drugstore is 20 miles away. And so you do need speed in that rural environment. So again, thinking of the context and trying to come up with context sensitive ideas. And the graphic on the left-hand side here is showing in Montgomery County, after I left, but was working with them as a consultant, we helped them think about, ITE still mostly runs in vehicle trips because we're still young in terms of collecting data on person trips. And so this is something that basically says there's a lot of math behind it, but the policy now is if you are, for the purposes of looking at vehicle trips, if you're in a red area, take the ITE trip rate and drop it by, and actually there's a lookup table. So there are, each little colored area has a specific number. So it might be 0.80 in Silver Spring and it might be 0.83 in Wheaton. And if you're out in the blue area, and Montgomery County is really kind of done, a third of the county is agriculturally or otherwise preserved, you're really essentially using the ITE vehicle trip generation rates. So let me pause there because that's kind of like a background to how do we link up our goals with the way we think about transportation projects and impacts before we dive into pro rata shared districts is the second topic. And if folks are content to be, everybody's still eating their sandwiches, so we'll just keep on going ahead then. So a pro rata shared district, a lot of the challenges that people have with
Hey,
the
Dan.
traditional TIA. Oh yeah.
Hi, I think Don Kostelik might have had his hand raised. Don, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks at that juncture. What do you have an example of? So for instance, we'll get into a traffic impact study for a development that says, the sky is falling because it might be level of service F in 2040. So we got to add this lane and do this and do this. And we don't consider how that either A, degrades the conditions for pedestrians or bicycles, or compromises their safety. What's the example within like the Montgomery County one where they are looking at trade-offs between those things?
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of creative ways that you can do it. And what pops to mind, well, so two ways to answer that. On the broad perspective, just about everybody that requires a TIA requires at least consideration of safety. Although one thing I will say in the ITE work that we'll talk about in a little bit is to really be focused on what you're raising, which is the cross-modal implications of, how you're addressing and making the sidewalk wider because there's a turn lane, or boy, with protected bicycles, there's a whole bunch of interesting things, protected bicycle lanes, a whole bunch of ways to think about how you're avoiding getting trapped, if you will. But there's also creative ways at the very micro level. One of the things Montgomery County does is essentially say, if you have vehicle impacts, we would rather have you in certain areas, as basically those red and orange areas, we'd rather have you take the dollars it takes to fix that and to help us build something in our master plan. So there's a great example of one way to do it just by policy. But having said that, that's, if you do that, you're then saying we're not so concerned in these areas, those red and orange areas. We're not so concerned about the traffic because from an equitable perspective, we'll let, and I should mention that the colors in this map are almost exactly the same as the colors for auto level of service, that in those red areas, you can have level of service F. In the orange areas, you need to have basically level of service E, which again, I'll mention, I've always thought that level of service E should stand for efficient because it means you have basically filled up the system that you built. You're making the most use out of it. One of my failures in trying that in Montgomery County was that the people that were concerned about congestion made a kind of almost a meme out of level of service E is LOSE, and that means lose. So, you do have to be just cognizant of the way people will react to things. But in Montgomery County, there's kind of that sense now. In those metro served areas, it's about the proximity rules. It's about being able to walk across the street to the drugstore. It's not about driving far for most people for most trips, even though there are certainly super commuters that still drive into those red areas. In the blue areas, again, it's more important to have a level of service D is still the threshold in those blue areas because it's about speed more than it is about proximity. There aren't drugstores across the street and there's really very little transit service. So people do need to rely on their cars. And so trying to, again, think equitably across all modes, this is kind of one of the maybe low hanging fruit, Don, that gets at a little bit of your question of, how do you just set the stage so that you're not trying to widen intersections to solve level of service D in an urban area, but allowing that to happen where that speed is more important than proximity in those kind of blue rural areas.
So before we go on, I see that Elaine Clegg has her hand raised. Elaine, do you have a question?
Okay, there we go. Now I got, yes, sorry, I had unmute and I lost my button. So Dan, showing over on the right, the links and nodes, I'm curious why you have the cul-de-sacs noted as nodes. I've always understood that if they don't connect to anything, they're not really a node.
And again, so there is legislative politics in play, because this was when Virginia had this was the way they decided to organize it. So this was the direction and the policy. And you're right, that's part of the reason why it probably didn't succeed, was because you could just say, oh, my cul-de-sacs now, I can still build a cul-de-sac community. And there's, again, a bunch of different ways that you can measure connectivity. Just dividing links and nodes is the simplest way, and that's also a balance in anything we do, right? Do you do something that's kind of quick and dirty, or do you require $5,000 of analysis to get there? So there's other root directness index is another buzzword that would get more at that issue of discounting the cul-de-sacs, even if you were to count them, to not value them very highly. I will also put in a pitch. There's a EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is an agency that does a lot of good work helping communities think about smart growth. And they have something called Smart Location Database, where they've taken each one of those dots basically and said, is it an auto-oriented intersection, or is it a multimodal-oriented intersection? Is it a three-legged intersection, or is it a four-legged intersection? And that they've actually, put some weights to it to say you could take all those red dots and come up with a score that really did reflect how well they connected to the rest of the system. So again, there's a great example of a teaser today for where you might want to be thinking about going, but that opens up a very happy kind of Pandora's box that you still have to think about. Then how do we want to move forward to make it either that kind of quick and dirty, make sure we're acknowledging and thinking about it, versus, and when we talk about level of traffic stress, we'll get into the fact that there's some things that really do require network level thinking, for both access, mobility, and safety.
So follow up on that. In this example, probably not, but in your work in general, do you count pedestrian links on top of the car links? So this one is only the car ones.
Right.
But at the end of both those cul-de-sacs, if you had a pedestrian link, you could rank the pedestrian network better than the car network. Have you ever done that?
Yeah, and that's kind of what the SLD is doing, is that you may have a multimodal link that is just where a bike path crosses the street. So, the cars can't turn there, but people can turn there. So that definitely occurs. And then when you think about accessibility, again, the whole idea of thinking multimodally about accessibility is to think about each network kind of separately. And then looking at the fact that, if you have a pedestrian only link, that's increasing the accessibility for pedestrians, not doing it for autos. So again, Prorata share districts are one of the things that in this ITE work, it's an emerging tool that it might fit for parts of Idaho. The goal is, it's like traffic impact taxes or fees, except the goal is really to be a lot more compact and focused on a place where you have a constituency, which is usually both the residents, businesses, and developers, all kind of agreeing we want to work together to create our master plan. And that one challenge that often happens in places where there's a lot of activity happening is, with one, it's going to sound like it's bad, with one-off TIAs, developer A comes in year one and says, I got to add this turn lane. Developer B comes in year two, and maybe it's still a very multimodal place, but in year two, their impact is you got to, put in a better trail connection. And then in year three, next developer comes in and it's like, well, we really didn't want that turn lane. So the goal of a Prorata share district is to come up with a detailed master plan. And the image here is, Baltimore, downtown Baltimore has about 6 areas where they've got separate little master plans. In the West Coast, Portland's system development charge is very much the same kind of thing. Do a small area study, figure out what you want to do multimodal, and then don't do any more TIAs, but just have developers put into a basically pay in to have to build the system. And again, developers could build a piece rather than paying in, but since often another challenge that we have is if you do one-off TIAs, developers are kind of limited to, I don't control that land, someone else has to do eminent domain for me to do to build that trail. Whereas if you're contributing into a public-private partnership, if you will, in a pro-rata share district, that kind of helps create a little less of a seam between public sector and private sector. And again, there's a bunch of them out there. Every state calls them something a little bit different. But one of the goals there is that, and I think I probably just spoke to all this, although the first part, again, the goal is to not look for ad hoc remedies, but to figure out how you're helping build a master plan. The concept of last in and free rider, again, most of the people on the call are probably familiar with the fact that in many cases, no matter what mode, if you're thinking about adequacy or capacity, you have a case where the public's already invested in something and developer A, B, C, D, E all come in when they don't fill things up, so they don't have to mitigate anything. And then developer F comes along and they're the straw that breaks the camel's back. And so you had a bunch of quote unquote free riders, and then you have last in. And when you do a pro rata share district, it helps kind of avoid that because you set up in advance for the next 20 years. This is what we want to be seeing. It's really one thing that's really important then is kind of that phasing and monitoring, because you do have one thing that you have to work through with an interested public is you're used to seeing and commenting on every development with whatever level of service they had. We're not doing that anymore, but we're going to do a study up front. And then we're going to every year or two, usually synced up with budget cycles, we're going to monitor how much development did we get, what's the new traffic system, how are we moving around, so that you are thinking about how you want to invest the dollars. And again, recognizing that this is not a silver bullet, but it does work very well in places where you have these kinds of concerns, particularly on overlapping improvements from different developments and or kind of that last in free rider concern. And again, I won't spend much time on this, but as part of the ITE work, this is again Montgomery County, maybe kind of getting at that. Again, here's sort of like the next step of what you might do. Montgomery County has set up 2 pro-rata share districts in White Flint and White Oak. And in Bethesda, they're still kind of working through that because it does take time to set these up. Once you set them up, it becomes more, more streamlined and predictable for everybody involved, public sector and private sector. Oh, and I think it looks like I meant to say table shows examples from Montgomery County, but it got cut off there. So again, maybe that's a little bit about pro-rata share districts. I'll pause just again before we kind of dive into the third category. And so again, ITE is an organization that probably most of you know very well. They do a lot of what's called recommended practices. And we are now, I was involved in the 2011 TIA for site development recommended practice. And we have updated that, or in the process of doing that. The late November, we put out a proposed recommended practice and had a couple months of, practitioner comment on the proposals. And we're now in the process of addressing about 400 comments that came back on that. And most of them were really, really good comments. We hope to get this actually out as a recommended practice, strike the proposed, sometime during the calendar year of 2022. And there's, again, I kind of mentioned that there's these areas of tension that are always out there. And one of them is that, we have aspirations as a community. We want to build a great place, but yet when it comes to what can the private sector be required to do as opposed to be asked to do, there's these kind of nexus perspectives. So thinking long range versus what can we get done right now. There's a kind of a tension between what's recommended and what's emerging. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. And there's kind of, for this recommended practice, the goal initially was really, this is for the practitioner. It's not for the policymaker, yet we also know that the way that policymakers get ideas, and I'm glad we have a lot of policymakers in the call today, is in part through practitioners, giving feedback to, this is something that really we should be changing our policy. And so what's happened in this update basically is sort of a chapter at the end that has things like a few pages on pro rata share districts that you might consider, even though the practitioner usually can't say, I want to do this one differently, but they can help the policymaker say, yeah, we might think about doing things differently. And so again, when it says recommended practice in transportation, we are not nearly as rigorous as the health industry is, but this is, again, evolution, not revolution. Even in the name of these things, it used to be way back in the day, everybody just said traffic impact studies. And I'm old enough that I struggle with that because traffic impact studies just rolls off your tongue. It's easy to say. Whereas transportation impact analyses, whether it's got multimodal or not, is a little bit tougher. But that's what's in a name is important, because if you just say it's traffic, you what is it? You manage what you measure. So you do need to be trying to consciously think about how you're branding what you're doing. And that, again, we know that I'm proud of the work we've done with this volunteer group, but actually the background information of what might be promising or emerging is almost as interesting as what we are able to conclude has had enough experience to be really a best practice. So just a little concept there, that just because something's not in a document doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad idea, just means that it's still in the process of being kind of tested. Again, this is sort of more just for the folks that probably most people know this, but essentially in the TIA world, it really is about nexus. And so the little flow chart is kind of a blow up of the basic, how are we doing today? How would we be doing in the future if there was not this new development? What's the marginal impact of that new development? And then what's the responsibility of the private sector to mitigate the new development's impacts? And again, that's very legalistic, and part of the goal of whether it's as formal as a pro rata share district or whether it's as informal as trying to have those conversations that you always have with the private sector community and public sector community anyway, about trying to get to a solution that helps us implement our plans and is fair and equitable to everybody without necessarily making it a you were 0.01 so you failed, or you were 0.02 so you passed. And that's so the process is still important from a nexus perspective, but the goal is to, again, be thinking about how to work with these kind of iterative loops in the flow chart so that you're getting the investment from the private sector towards transportation that's what you want, and not just what the what the tool said they had to do. To get back to kind of thinking about one of the first steps that I know people often come up with is, well, I got all this data from ITE about vehicle trips, and I just can't deal with pedestrians and bicyclists and transit users. And that is one of the elements that's both in the recommended practice as well as getting more built into other ITE products on trip generation in particular, is to start thinking in terms of person trips, and that here's a good deal. What's proposed in the report is something that says, if you're in an environment where you really don't have information about person trips, all you have is a lookup table for vehicle trips. Well, you can take those vehicle trips and you can expand them in that top half there to get to an estimate of person trips. And that's pretty easy to do. You could use the numbers that are in the sources in this manual, or you may have better information locally. And then you can then say, hey, I do have better information. In step 2, I'm going to do something that says, if I know transit's a certain amount, don't use national data, adjust those percentages. So I'm reflecting the local data. And then the last thing then is that this really helps you then set up, if I'm going to do something that's going to change the mode share, how much do I think I will change the mode share, and to make sure you're pivoting off of something that is a reasonable baseline as opposed to just the assumption. A lot of people usually just intuitively, but sometimes purposefully, like to say, well, ITE said I had 100 vehicle trips, and so that means I have 100 person trips. And I'm going to get 5 people walking and biking, so now I have 95 person trips. Well, that 100 person trips that came from ITE, there were probably 5 people walking and biking anyway, they just weren't in there. So, making sure that as you think about how much mode share you might get, that you're starting from a place that is thinking about person trips. The kind of 2 little warning bullets up there. One is that we're so used to, as an industry, thinking about the journey to work as the most important trip. And, you know, for many people, that is their longest trip. It's the one that drives their decisions the most because they've got to make an income. Yet it's, you know, doesn't account, it only accounts for about a quarter of all trips across the day anyway. And that it's the mode shares you will get for journey to work are very different than the mode shares you get from everything else. Again, that idea of walking to the drugstore at lunchtime or whatever is a trip, but it's not a journey to work trip. That kind of leads then to, we're getting pretty good about you know, thinking about transit and thinking about walking and biking in general. We are still struggling with auto passengers, and even just when someone says, you know, how many people are carpooling? Oh, it's, you know, 10% carpooling. Did you include the driver of the carpool in that 10%? And often, I got to go back and look that up. I'm not sure. So just thinking about auto passengers, the other thing that most people say is, my goodness, 33% auto passengers? That can't be right, because we don't carpool to work as a country. We used to a little bit more than we do, but carpooling is not a way to get to work. Yet it is something that happens, as particularly, you know, you go into a party, you might take your friend along with you, you might take your spouse along with you. And the last piece here is that there's often what I kind of call captive riders. You know, you've got your 3-year-old in the car seat to go to the grocery store. That 3-year-old is not necessarily helping you with the grocery store, but they are, if somebody observes them, they are being counted as an auto passenger. So just being aware that that's probably the biggest kind of shock, as people say, wow, there's really that many auto passengers out there. And you can kind of see we're using, you know, national survey data as a starting point. A little bit more just kind of thinking about how you think in terms of person trips. 2 examples here again. You know, it's always kind of fun to think, you know, will what works in Manhattan, New York work in Manhattan, Kansas? And some ideas really do. And so what, you know, New York City has a very structured city environmental quality regulations, and they've taken the whole city and basically said, if you're in these different zones, we're going to give you assumptions for what your mode shares are based on the data that they have. And again, trying to make it a little bit streamlined, so that rather than every block in New York City having to go out and do a separate study and come up with their own mode shares, there's a starting point that says, in these geographic areas, this is what we want you to assume. And on the right side, it's the same kind of information that I showed on Montgomery County earlier, is just telling people based on, in this case, it was Montgomery County's travel demand model as a starting point, a couple of little tweaks made to it to make sure that it made sense. To, you know, what are the assumptions you should be using, but then fed back to that first picture of, hey, if all you need to look at is autos for a variety of reasons, you know, you would take the ITE auto rate and multiply it by 0.9. And then kind of thinking about, oh, good. I'm like, so there's, I mentioned EPA for the SLD, the Smart Location Database, before, with the kind of question about thinking about connectivity. There's also an EPA mixed development, MXD, trip generation tool, that really helps you think about taking an ITE kind of rate and putting it into the context of what's around it and what the multimodal systems are. And this is an example of a graphic where we did some planning work in Delaware, and, you know, had one location where we knew how much expected land use there was in a vicinity, you know, about a 100-acre site. And that part of the goal here was to get more balanced uses in, so that we tested a new land use where, again, the development community we knew would need, you know, a little more commercial development in order to help get the residential development market going. And on the right-hand side is basically, in this case, it's not VMT, but it's just vehicle trips. And, you know, there's a case where you say, oh, we're going to allow more development in, so we're going to get more traffic. And that's, oh, isn't that a bad thing? But if you start looking at things like that connectivity index, so if you take that monolithic development and split it up into walkable locations with some blocks, so that you're focused more on door to door for the buildings, as opposed to the door of the car to the door of one building, you actually, there's good information that says you start reducing the number of vehicle trips, because you're creating a place where people can, for those shorter trips, make a choice to walk, as opposed to you know, getting in their car to drive from one end of the parking lot to the other. If we did something then and said, let's change the diversity, take the same mass of buildings, but basically get it so we're not adding a little bit to the commercial, but adding a little more of the residential, which again, the market has to be able to bring it. So it's an assumption, but it's a starting point. That also helps you reduce your vehicle trips. And then the last thing we just did was simply to say, if we looked at how many parking spaces were provided with the residential development, and if you took that from the 1.5 that's the average for the area now and made it down to 1, you'd further reduce trips. So again, just sort of this is probably more messaging than it is, technical analysis for how to have those kinds of conversations where people say growth is bad because growth is bringing me more traffic congestion. I did want to say just a couple words about the VMT because it is a really hot topic. And VMT, as the Google Ngram at the top shows, we've been talking about vehicle miles of travel for mostly things like a measure of safety. We know crashes aren't the determinant of whether something is safe or not, but they are a leading indicator that we've got. But we have to make sure that there's some sense of how many crashes is a function partly of how many people are out there that could possibly run into each other. So that vehicle miles of travel has been around a long time, but California's work to say we're going to stop looking at auto level, or to stop making local jurisdictions look at auto level of service and we'd like you to use VMT is part of the story. And so like right now on the lower right-hand corner is another example of where, kind of like Montgomery County, except now it's for VMT as opposed to auto trips, a lookup table that says if you're developing in this certain area, this is what we, from our modeling data, this is what we want you to assume that you're above or below the average for the area. So again, the idea of replacing auto level of service with VMT is a really neat idea. And we thought about it long and hard in our ITE work and figured that it's an emerging practice, but yet it's very, very complex. I mean, it seems so simple. The concept is so simple, but implementing it is so complex. It's taken 10 years so far for California to get from the starting point to basically letting the jurisdictions do their own thing and figure out what's working. The people... Auto level of service has been around so long that people tend to forget that the way it really got created was in the 60s. They got survey groups into a room and sort of said, sit in this chair. Now pretend you're at a stop sign. Do you think you've waited long enough to make your left turn? Raise your hand when you think you've waited long enough. And that, through those kinds of comfort, basically, the quality and comfort of the auto trip, that's how the 55 seconds, 80 seconds, all those numbers came about was through focus groups. Now we're starting to do that with other tools, but we don't have something that says 5 VMT is good and 6 VMT is bad, which is why so far the standard is kind of like, well, let's look at how we're doing against an average. And so we don't see that yet as a nationwide best practice, but we, maybe in 10 years we update this and we'll have some really good lessons learned from California that shows there are some best practices that come out of that. And again, there's a lot of kind of context-based assessments like, how far people are driving from just survey data does tell you something about what their needs are. And there's choice involved, but it's back to the same thing. If you are in a very, very urban area, your observed VMT per capita is going to be lower than it is if you're in a rural area, just based on that speed versus proximity kind of tension. I appreciate Don sent me kind of a link to what Ada County Highway District is doing now in terms of just starting to think about level of traffic stress. And so more and more we're seeing non-auto facilities being incorporated into TIAs, but we still have this challenge of defining nexus. And two particular areas of challenges there. One is that, we've got, and again, maybe during Q&A, we'll go into if folks want any more of a briefing of just what this colored chart means. I was saying, what is the environment of the street and what does that mean in terms of the comfort level that a bicyclist would have, recognizing that bicyclists really are not, they're not all the same, they're not all created the same. So a common approach kind of now is to say, well, let's do some analysis in the MTIA, but then it's difficult sometimes to get a nexus that says you must create this bicycle link or, create a separated bicycle lane at this location, just because the process, the industry is still a little bit new here. But two things happen. One is that by doing the analysis, again, you manage what you measure. So by doing the analysis, you might get the private sector to say, oh yeah, now we see that we would like to have this particular bike facility or pedestrian facility, because it'll help us with our market. And, we didn't actually think about that, what was happening a block away or 2 blocks away when we developed our pro formas. So there's again, that kind of proffer idea. And then even if nothing happens from the private sector, what you're doing is shining a spotlight on the needs and helping with public sector investment. And so, level of traffic stress is one of those things that is out there. We have vision and target zero is a kind of the same thing. Vision zero, target zero. There's a number, there's a goal, but yet again, we don't expect to to be revolutionary and immediately get to the point where we say we want no more economic development because we can't solve all the crashes yet. So trying to figure out how to move in that direction without while still being pragmatic in terms of economic development. So actually that's kind of the end of we got 15 minutes left, so we probably ran a little long, but I think kind of where many of the people on the call today are is just thinking about what are the products we have now, what have we adopted, how are we measuring success, how is that going into our design standards, how are we engaging public and private sector to help build our communities, and what's working well today and what things might you want to be considering or changing. And I will just go to the end for now, just because my contact info is on the last slide, and I've sent the deck over to Cynthia so she could distribute it if that's helpful.
Hi, Dan. Yeah, I want to open this up to questions right now, but before I do that, I'm wondering if you could clarify something for us. You talked a lot about the ITE, and our DOT is called the ITD. So there's a lot of confusion, I know, because people get them confused. But I wondered if you could just explain what the ITE is and what they do and how you've been working with them. And then what I'd like to do, because I believe that a lot of their information is used by our transportation agencies like ITD and Ada County Highway District. So it would be great to hear from you, your work with them, what they do. And then maybe what we could do is invite some of the people who have been on the other end with ACHD or ITD to talk about, do they use those tools and sort of how that relationship is. Do you mind doing that?
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. Again, ITE, Institute of Transportation Engineers, has been around since 1930. Probably mostly known by people as the writers or the authors of trip generation and parking generation. And again, these recommended practices are supporting documents that probably aren't used quite as much. But those are probably the 2 things that I would imagine most of the people are familiar with using. ITE also does offer guidance on things like, how do you, ITE partnered with Congress for New Urbanism about a decade ago, CNU, on essentially how do you think about building multimodal facilities. And again, very much the same thing. Here are ideas and some best practices and some emerging practices, but in every case, of course, ITE is a professional society, basically. And so it's ideas that then can be used to turn into design standards or practices that really, are required at more of a jurisdictional level than at kind of a national professional society level. One thing that's really kind of funny, we're having some conversations. I've been volunteering with ITE for 30 years, 15,000 members, and also some agency memberships. And as we talk to planners and trying to, bridge some silos, a lot of people say, oh yeah, I knew ITE wrote those big books, but I had no idea you could join ITE. I thought it was just a publishing house. So yeah, there are 15,000 people that probably 1,000 of them are very active, both in their, like me, in their personal lives as helping ITE while we're doing our own day-to-day jobs.
Thank you for that explanation. I really appreciate it. At this time, if Margaret Ken or I think Tom Laws is on here, if anybody wants to speak up on how your agencies work with IT, that would be great to sort of help people make that connection. If not, we'll move on to other questions.
Cynthia, I can speak a little bit, but I would say from the long range planning side, we don't use it too much. I know that our engineers and our more current planners that are looking at those TISs and TIAs definitely do, but in terms of the project identification and long range planning, not too much over on my end.
Thanks, Tom.
And ITE, I'll just also mention two things. One is that probably the predominance of the membership is local jurisdictions. So there are state UTs, federal agencies, but it's a largely local jurisdictions. And one of the last recommended practice that was very controversial was traffic signal change intervals. So basically, what's the dilemma zone for how long a light stays yellow? So a lot of operational elements for ITE members in addition to kind of longer range planning.
So while everybody's thinking up their questions, I have another question that I want to ask you, Dan, and it's about impact fees, because we've been talking a lot about those with our local highway district and how those funds can go toward biking and walking facilities. I'm just curious, what do you see in the communities that you've worked in?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Actually, we are just wrapping up now, taking Miami-Dade counties, which is essentially Miami and all its suburbs, from where they 20 years ago established a road impact fee, and we're now turning it into a multimodal impact fee. And so the two pieces, again, just like I've kind of been saying, is getting data that says, in downtown Miami, it's really important. You're going to get a lot more pedestrians and bicyclists and transit users than you are car users. And you do need to build all those systems. So essentially taking the same thing that people have often done for autos, how many trips, what's the cost, that type of thing, and then making it branching it out to be multimodal. Where the art really is coming in is in terms of the allocation of funds, because it's easy to think of the moving parts of the system, pedestrians moving very differently than buses, moving differently than cars and trucks. But when you design a facility, if you're doing a complete street, you're basically, hopefully you're helping all the modes at the same time. And so the operating assumption, as we've drafted language for changing the code, but it has not gone, still basically in legal staff at Miami-Dade County, is this sufficient? Is to say, you could take the roadway funds and apply them to anything that's multimodal. As long as you're improving the bikes and pedestrians as part of your roadway design, you could be using that roadway fund, which will still be the biggest chunk of money coming in, because again, it is true that when you think about person miles of travel as opposed to vehicle miles of travel, it's still the vehicles on almost any development in all but the most urban areas that are going to have that kind of greatest need, but making sure that you're crediting the fact that you can do a lot of stuff for pedestrians and bicyclists while you're arguably doing a roadway project.
And just a follow-up question, then do you equate it to fewer motorists on the road, so less money going toward, say, widening the road, for example?
Yeah, actually, that's part of it too, is to make sure that when you do any of that thinking in person trips, you are at least expanding the idea. And again, what we did with Miami-Dade was looking at their 2040 long range plan and thinking about that level of growth and time frame. But just to go back up, for example, in this example, if you're starting at 100 vehicle trips, you just haven't thought about the other modes, well, you're still going to have the same number of vehicle trips to start with. You're just now thinking about the other modes. But if you then say, but I got context that says it's really not 100, it's really 92, my 202 person trips, this is what you're getting at, Cynthia. Maybe I'm in a context where that 100 trips shouldn't be 100, it should be 92. And then maybe you say, I could do something that would change the way I get people to and from my site. And so maybe that 92 goes down even further. And in that case, yes, you're right that you're saying, less dollars for traffic, if you will, but more dollars going to other types of modes. And the one thing that's true in Miami-Dade, and I think, I'm trying to think of, would it translate to a place like Boise, for instance, is that in Miami-Dade, a lot of folks under the old paradigm did that thing where they said, 100 auto drivers, but I've got 20% transit ridership. So give me credit for that. I want 80 drivers and 20 transit riders. And the first reaction again is, no, you still got 100 drivers. You just have the 20 transit users in addition to those. So let's think about that. The other thing is that in doing so, they often saved a lot of money, because now I only got to solve the problems of 80 vehicles. And transit in a place like Miami, certainly, and probably in a lot of places, if you're really building separate transit ways, a bus lane, for instance, or even a queue jumper, those transit costs end up being not too dissimilar from the auto costs. So that, we think that one shift that will happen in Miami-Dade is people will stop saying, oh, I'm all about transit, give me credit, And because if they do, now their cost for accommodating those transit trips will be not that dissimilar from the cost of auto trips. But the non-motorized modes, where again, you've usually got most of the, the possibility and potential for the infrastructure out there, sidewalk gaps notwithstanding, ADA compatibility notwithstanding, those do tend to have lower per capita costs, if you will. So again, the hope is to also be encouraging people to think about how through density, diversity, and design, they can be encouraging shorter trips. And by encouraging shorter trips, you almost naturally get some of them into walking and biking.
Thanks. That was a great explanation. Don, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think it's directly related to that, Dan, and I'm going back in the recesses of my mind. So I know Jim Hans is on here and he can tell me if that's still the thinking. When we talked about bike and ped impact fee related stuff more than a decade ago here, it was pretty much said that we had to figure out a measure to say that X number of bike ped trips had to replace vehicle trips. And that was kind of used as the reason to not do it. So you're saying there's kind of a different method to combine it in a way that doesn't get you to that level. That's my first question. Then I have a second one.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. Again, you don't need to change mode share in order to be thinking about person trips. You could, again, using this example, which I know is a very simplistic kind of iconic thing, but you can stop at item 1 and just say, I'm done. But now I know I'm done with the math, but now I have to figure out, again, auto passengers, they're all in autos, so I'm not too worried about them, but the transit non-motorized and the choice whether to take non-motorized and split it into walk bike, which again is a challenge we have a lot of places where they've been lumped together. So what do you do with those 30 trips? And that in my mind, you should not say we can't add to the pie, if you will. But also one of the things that's happening in Miami is, developers are saying, is this going to help me or hurt me? So, there's always a tension of everybody saying my funds are scarce. I'd love to have other people participate more.
Okay. Yeah, I think the other important point you made, and I kind of made it in the sidebar, because I think the other thing that makes us shy away from bike ped transit in development analysis is this belief that this motorist level of service and this trip generation manual is some sort of sacred science where the thing is kind of fluff. And what I hear you saying is the premise of motorist level of service isn't that well grounded in science. And if I remember right from the ITE trip generation manual, some of those data sets only have 3 or 4 data points that we're using to estimate those. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. And again, it's one thing I would, the report says, it urges, for those policymakers, resist the temptation if you can to codify something in the trip generation manual, because there's always room for good judgment. But what it does do, even if you only have 3 or 4 points, at least it's a starting point for that conversation. It's an expectation of this is what all else being equal we would expect. And then you have these conversations about, well, is everything else equal or not?
We have 1 minute left. Does anybody else have a question for Dan before we lose him today? I have a comment then. I find it discouraging to hear how you described motorist level of service came about as people were sitting in their chairs saying, yep, this is plenty long enough to sit here. So it sounds like the 85th percentile, where I think there was one study once that talked about, how to calculate the speed of a rural road or something I heard at one point. So,
well, I think a positive evolution is that a lot of states are using this quality of service as a thought point, because there is a lot to providing comfort and quality and safety, to encouraging mode shift for a lot of customers, if you will. But yeah, it's just that kind of mindset is to recognize that even what was called level of service really was about quality of service. How comfortable are you sitting in your car? And we all kind of know too that, the places that are the most economically successful tend to be the ones that are the most congested.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all this information today. I have written down some notes. I see a follow-up, at least discussion that's going to happen. And I know everybody appreciated your time and information today. So thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Dan, I wanted to say a specific thank you to Dan too, just because I've been interested for many years of how to reform LOS. And I'm a real visual learner. And so your slide, the transportation policy area slide map where you're showing, you know, the different areas, that was so helpful to me. And because it reminds me of, you know, some of you guys on the call are familiar with form-based codes. So it's kind of like a land use form-based code, but for transportation impact policy. So that just is the solution right there. I just love it so much. And it's funny that you say it's taken California 10 years since they decided, oh, we want to reduce VMT. Well, it's an easy idea, but how do you actually implement it? It's funny because I was in California when SB 732 passed, which was the beginning. So this is just amazing. And also, Cynthia, I just wanted to say, just FYI, Caltrans, they are putting together a speed reduction task force, and they are revising their 85th percentile, one of their codes. You know, that's what, anyway, Caltrans is working on that right now. So thank you so much, Dan. And I'll be following up with you later, Dan, with more questions.
Well, what you just said was, I was getting some interesting shivers when Dan was talking about the Montgomery County example, and I'm going to share this document. We were talking about variable level of service thresholds in Ada County with ACHD's Transportation Land Use Integration Plan. And the link I provided you is a portion of that $1 million study that was never adopted that addresses the exact same thing with the dots that Dan is getting at. I think Charlotte DOT is an agency that at that time was doing this, and you'll actually find some language in that document about kind of the shortcomings or fallacies of traffic models and why we shouldn't rely on them so heavily for billion-dollar investment programs, because there's a lot of science in there, for lack of a better word. But there's it to download, and I think it brings home with some local context some of the things Dan talked about, and to think we were talking about that 15 years ago.
Yeah. Well, yes, right. So, but again, both a little depressing and a little inspiring. So at least, you know, having had that conversation, okay, what's changed in 15 years, and how do you regroup around that kind of conversation?
Yeah, definitely the metrics with level of traffic stress and things are much more advanced than back then, when those were definitely more of a challenge.
Yep.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for your time today. That was really fascinating. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We appreciate it. I've recorded this today, so we'll make it public in case people want to share this recording with others.
Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.